The ground under my feet cracked as the fourth champion of the night fell backward, thrown across the chamber like a piece of paper caught in a storm. I did not move. I never moved. My duty was to watch, not to help, and after 300 years of standing beside this armor, I had learned that helping only got you killed faster. My name is Kalen Voss, and I am the keeper of the Hollow Shrine, a title that sounds important until you understand what it actually means. It means I light the lamps. It means I sweep the dust off a suit of armor that has never once let anyone wear it. It means I watch, year after year, as the proudest warriors in the galaxy walk into this chamber, certain they will be the one, and I watch them walk out broken, or not walk out at all. The armor stood on its pedestal, at the center of the chamber, silver and black, humming faintly with a light that never went out and never explained itself. It looked peaceful, it looked patient, it was neither of those things. The champion who had just been thrown across the room was a Draymir warlord named Osek, a man built like a small mountain, with 4 arms and a chest plate made from the hide of something he had killed himself. He groaned, rolled onto his side, and spat out a tooth. His guards rushed forward to help him stand, but he waved them off, his pride wounded worse than his body. "It rejected me," he said, as if he could not quite believe the words leaving his own mouth. "It rejects everyone," I told him, "because someone had to say it, and it was always my job to say the things no one wanted to hear." Osek turned to look at me, his 4 eyes narrowing. "Then why does it exist? Why do we keep sending our best to die in front of a piece of metal that serves no purpose?" I did not have a good answer for him. I never did. The truth was that nobody alive knew why the armor existed, only that it had been found 900 years ago inside a temple built by a species that no longer walked among the stars. The people who made it were gone. The reason they made it was gone with them. All that remained was the armor itself, sitting on its pedestal, waiting for something none of us understood. Osek left the chamber without another word, his guards trailing behind him, carrying the weight of his failure like a physical thing. He was not the first warlord to leave this shrine feeling smaller than when he arrived, and he would not be the last. I walked closer to the armor once the chamber was empty, the way I always did after a trial ended. Up close you could see the fine details carved into its surface, symbols that no living scholar had ever translated, patterns that seemed to shift slightly depending on the angle you looked at them. Some nights, if I stood there long enough, I almost believed the armor was looking back at me. "You have rejected 211 wielders," I said quietly, more to myself than to the armor, because talking to it had become a habit I could not break after 3 centuries of solitary service. Kings, generals, priests, monsters. Every kind of person this galaxy has to offer. Tell me, what exactly are you waiting for? The armor did not answer. It never did. I had come to the shrine as a young Vantiri scholar, eager and foolish, certain that I would be the one to finally understand its purpose. My people live a very long time, long enough that 300 years feels less like a lifetime and more like a long afternoon, but even for us, patience runs out eventually. I was no longer eager, I was no longer foolish, I was simply tired, and I had begun to suspect that I would die at this post, still waiting, still watching, still failing to understand. The next morning, word arrived that changed everything, though I did not know it yet. A courier ship landed outside the shrine grounds, its markings belonging to the Coalition fleet, the loose alliance of species that had been fighting a slow, grinding war against the Threll Dominion for longer than most people could remember. The Threll were expanding, consuming smaller worlds, and the Coalition had been losing ground for 3 years straight. Everyone in the galaxy knew the war was going badly. What they did not know was how badly, and how soon it would reach shrines like mine. The courier was a young Coalition officer named Priya Malhotra, her uniform dusty from travel, her eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in a very long time. She bowed to me, the way visitors always did, out of respect for the shrine rather than for me personally. "Keeper Voss," she said, "I bring a request from Fleet Command." "Another champion," I said. It was not a question. It was the only reason anyone ever came here anymore. "Not exactly." She hesitated, choosing her words with visible care. Fleet Command wants to send someone new, someone from a species that has never attempted the trial before. I raised an eyebrow, or at least the Vantiri equivalent of one, a slight ridge above my eyes that lifted when I was surprised. There are no new species left in this galaxy, Officer Malhotra. Every civilization within reach of this shrine has already sent its champions. Not every civilization, she said. Humanity has not. I had heard of humanity, of course. Everyone had, by then. They were the newest members of the coalition, a species that had only reached the stars a few decades earlier, small and fragile compared to most of the galaxy's great powers, with a homeworld that seemed almost quaint next to the ancient empires that surrounded it. They were also, according to every report I had read, remarkably stubborn for a species so young. They had joined the war against the Threll despite having no real reason to, despite the fact that the front lines were nowhere near their territory, despite the fact that most of the coalition's older members had quietly suggested that humanity stay out of a fight it could not possibly survive. Why would Fleet Command send a human here? I asked. They have no history with the armor, no tradition of the trial. Why waste the effort? Priya's mouth tightened into something that was almost a smile, but not quite. Because we are out of other options, Keeper. The Threll have broken through 3 defensive lines in the last 2 months. If the war continues at this pace, the coalition will not last another year. Fleet Command is willing to try anything now, even something as unlikely as this. I studied her face for a long moment, trying to decide whether she believed what she was saying, or whether she was simply following orders she did not fully understand. In the end, it did not matter. My role was not to approve or deny requests. My role was to open the chamber and let the trial happen, whatever the outcome. Bring your champion, I said. The armor will judge, as it always has. 3 days later, the human arrived. His name was Ethan Cole, and my first impression of him was that he did not look like someone sent to save a galaxy. He was of average height for his species, with dark hair cut short and a face that showed more tiredness than confidence. He wore a simple coalition uniform, unremarkable except for a small patch on his shoulder that marked him as part of a unit called the Ashfield Rangers, a name I did not recognize, though Priya later explained they were a small human ground force that had somehow held a critical supply line against 3 separate Threll assaults, an accomplishment that should have been impossible given the numbers involved. You are the champion, I said, though it came out sounding more like a question. I guess so, Ethan said. His voice was quieter than I expected, none of the booming confidence that warlords like Osek carried into every room. Honestly, I still don't fully understand why they picked me for this. There were officers with better records. Why do you think they chose you then? I asked, curious despite myself. He thought about it for a moment before answering. Maybe because I never really quit on anything, even when the numbers said I should have. That's not a special skill. Half my unit is the same way. We just don't like losing, and we especially don't like giving up before we've actually lost. It was a strange answer, humble and plain, nothing like the declarations of destiny and glory I had heard from every other champion who had stood in this chamber. I did not know yet whether it meant anything, but I filed it away, the way I filed away every small detail, because after 300 years of watching failures, I had learned that the smallest details were sometimes the only ones that mattered. I led him into the chamber that evening, Priya and a small group of coalition officers following at a respectful distance, along with 2 representatives from other species who had come to observe, drawn by curiosity about this new and unproven contender. One of them, a Threll defector named Corin, who had abandoned the Dominion years earlier and now served as a coalition advisor, watched the proceedings with open skepticism written across his sharp, angular face. This will not take long, Corin muttered to no one in particular, loud enough for everyone to hear. The humans are children playing dress-up in a war that will bury them. This armor was forged for warriors, not for whatever this species imagines itself to be. I did not respond to him. I had heard variations of that same sentiment for centuries, aimed at nearly every species that had ever failed the trial. It rarely proved useful to argue with pride before pride had been tested. Ethan stepped forward without waiting for further instruction, standing before the pedestal exactly where 211 champions had stood before him. He looked at the armor for a long moment, not with the hungry ambition I usually saw, but with something closer to simple respect, the way a person might look at an old machine whose purpose they did not yet understand, but were willing to learn. "What happens now?" he asked me quietly. "You reach out and place your hand on it," I said. "That is all the ritual requires. The armor does the rest." He nodded once, took a breath, and reached forward. The moment his fingers touched the surface, the light around the chamber changed, shifting from its usual steady glow into something sharper, more active, symbols along the armor's plating flaring brighter than I had ever seen them flare before. I felt my pulse quicken, an old instinct from centuries of watching, because I knew, in that instant, that something was different. Every previous trial had ended within seconds, the armor's rejection swift and absolute. This one did not end within seconds. It kept going. Ethan's face tightened, a visible strain crossing his features, but he did not pull his hand away, and he did not fall. The chamber filled with a low humming sound that grew steadily louder, the ancient symbols pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, almost like breathing. Priya took a step forward, alarm crossing her face, but I raised a hand to stop her, my eyes fixed on the pedestal, my mind racing through 3 centuries of memory trying to find anything comparable to what I was witnessing. There was nothing comparable. This had never happened before. "Keeper," Priya said, her voice tight with worry. "Is this normal? Is he in danger?" "I do not know," I admitted, and the words felt strange in my mouth, because admitting ignorance was not something I did often, not after 300 years of believing I understood this shrine better than anyone alive. I have never seen the trial last this long. Corin's earlier skepticism had drained from his face entirely, replaced by something more careful, more watchful. Even he seemed to understand that whatever was happening in front of us had broken every pattern the galaxy had come to expect from this ancient, silent guardian. The humming reached a peak, the light in the chamber flaring so bright that several of the observers had to shield their eyes, and then, all at once, it stopped. Silence fell over the chamber, thick and total, broken only by the sound of Ethan's breathing, ragged but steady. He was still standing, he was still whole, his hand was still resting on the surface of the armor, and the armor had not thrown him, had not struck him down, had not done any of the things it had done to every single champion before him. I stared at the pedestal, my mind struggling to process what my eyes were telling me, because after 300 years of watching this armor reject every single person who dared to touch it, I was looking at the first moment in its recorded history where it had not said no. It had not yet said yes either. But for the first time in 900 years, it had not said no. And somehow, that silence felt louder than every rejection that came before it. No one in the chamber moved. I do not think anyone remembered how to move. 211 failures had trained every observer who ever stood in this room to expect a single outcome, swift and violent, and now that outcome had simply refused to arrive. Ethan finally lifted his hand from the armor's surface, slowly, as if he was not entirely sure it was safe to do so. He looked down at his own fingers, turning them over, checking for damage that was not there. Then he looked at me, and for the first time since he had walked into the chamber, I saw something close to fear in his expression. "What just happened?" he asked. "I was hoping you could tell me," I said. Priya rushed forward despite my earlier gesture for her to wait, gripping Ethan's shoulder, scanning him for injuries with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years checking soldiers for wounds they were too stubborn to mention. "Are you hurt? Anything feel wrong? Any pain?" "I'm fine," Ethan said, though his voice carried a note of confusion that suggested he was not entirely certain of that himself. "It didn't hurt. It just felt like something was looking at me, really looking, the way you'd look at someone you were trying to figure out." Corin stepped closer, his earlier scorn replaced entirely by a sharp, calculating attention that made me uneasy in a different way. The Thrall had a long and complicated history with this shrine, and I did not trust the sudden interest in his eyes. "The armor has never hesitated," Corin said slowly, as if testing each word before letting it out. "Not once in 900 years of recorded trials. Every failure before this one ended within moments. This is not a small anomaly, Keeper Voss. This is something else entirely. I did not disagree with him, though I disliked how eager he suddenly seemed to be part of this discovery, given how loudly he had dismissed Ethan only minutes earlier. I turned my attention back to the armor itself, studying the symbols along its surface, searching for any change, any sign of what had just occurred. The symbols were different. I had studied this armor for 3 centuries, memorized every curve and marking along its plating, and I could say with absolute certainty that the pattern glowing faintly across its chest plate had never existed before tonight. It was new. It had appeared during the trial, as though the armor itself had written something in response to whatever it found in Ethan Cole. Priya, I said, does your coalition have anyone capable of reading ancient precursor script? A linguist, a historian, anyone? We have people back at Fleet Command, she said. I can send for them. But Keeper, with respect, shouldn't you be the expert here? You've guarded this shrine for centuries. I have guarded it, I said. I have studied it, but I have never seen it change before tonight, and change is exactly the sort of thing I do not have the answers for. We spent the following hours in careful examination, myself and a small team of scholars who arrived by shuttle within the day, all of us circling the armor like hunters, uncertain whether the animal in front of them was wounded or simply waiting. Ethan sat off to one side during most of this, watching quietly, occasionally answering questions about exactly what he had felt during the trial, though his answers remained frustratingly vague. He described a pressure behind his eyes, a sensation of being measured against some standard he could not name, and a moment near the end, where he said it felt like the armor had asked him a question without using words, and he had answered it without knowing exactly what the question was. That is not how the trial has ever worked, said one of the visiting scholars, a Vantiri historian named Ferris, who had studied the shrine's records for decades from a distance, though he had never before set foot inside the chamber itself. Every account we have describes an instantaneous judgment. Acceptance or rejection, delivered in a heartbeat. There is no precedent for a dialogue. Then perhaps we have simply never had a champion the armor wanted to have a dialogue with, I said, and the words surprised me even as I spoke them, because I had not consciously arrived at that idea until it was already leaving my mouth. Ferris frowned at me, his long fingers tapping against the edge of his data slate. You believe the armor is intelligent, conscious, in some meaningful sense? I believe, I said carefully, that after 300 years of watching this armor reject warlords, emperors and priests, without a moment's hesitation, and then watching it pause, truly pause, in front of a soldier from a species barely 50 years into space travel, I am no longer certain what I believe. I only know that something has changed, and I intend to find out what. That night, after the scholars had retreated to their quarters and the shrine grounds had gone quiet, I found Ethan sitting alone on the stone steps outside the chamber, looking up at the unfamiliar stars of this world, far from whatever sky he called home. You should be resting, I said, settling down beside him, despite the awkwardness of my joints, after standing all day. Can't sleep, he said, too much running through my head. Tell me about your homeworld, I said, because I found myself genuinely curious about the species that had, in a single evening, undone 900 years of certainty. He was quiet for a moment before he answered. It's not that different from a lot of worlds, I imagine. We fight each other plenty, when we're not fighting something bigger. We've spent most of our history figuring out how to survive things that wanted to kill us, sometimes each other, sometimes just the planet itself. I think that's part of why the Ashfield Rangers exist. We're not the strongest unit in the fleet, not even close. We're just the ones who keep showing up, even after we've been told the fight is already lost. Is that why you volunteered for this trial? I asked. Because you were told the war was already lost? He gave a short, humorless laugh. Nobody says it in those exact words, but yeah, that's basically the situation. The Thrill have pushed the coalition back 3 defensive lines in 2 months. Command is grasping at anything that might slow that down. And someone remembered this old legend about an armor that never lets anyone wear it. I think half of them expected me to walk in here, get thrown across the room like everyone else, and that would be that. A box checked, an option eliminated, nothing lost but a few days of travel. And instead, I said. And instead, something happened that nobody expected, including me, he finished. I don't know what it means, Keeper Voss. I don't know if it means anything good. I looked at him for a long moment, this young human with tired eyes and no particular claim to greatness, sitting on ancient steps built by a species that no longer existed, having just done something that no warlord, no emperor, no legendary champion had managed to do in 900 years of trying. Neither do I admitted, but I intend to find out, and I suspect you will be finding out right alongside me. The following morning brought new arrivals, word of the unprecedented event having spread faster than I expected through coalition channels. A Threll military attaché arrived under diplomatic protocol, ostensibly to observe on behalf of the defector community that had aligned with the coalition, though I suspected his true purpose was to gather information for reasons that had little to do with cooperation. A delegation of Vorathi merchants arrived as well, drawn by rumor and the promise of profit, though what exactly they hoped to profit from remained unclear to me. More importantly, a formal envoy arrived from Fleet Command itself, a senior officer named Colonel Daniel Hartley, who I quickly gathered held significant authority over how this unprecedented event would be handled from the coalition's side. He was an older man, grey at the temples, with the careful, measured manner of someone who had survived a long career by never rushing into judgment. "Keeper Voss," he said, greeting me with the formal bow that visitors always offered, "I understand the trial has produced results without historical precedent." "That would be an accurate description, yes," I said. "Fleet Command wants to understand exactly what we are dealing with before we proceed further," Hartley said. "Is the armor safe to continue engaging with Private Cole? Is there risk to his life if the trial resumes?" It was a fair question, and one I did not have a confident answer for. "The trial paused rather than concluding," I said. "In 900 years, that has never happened. I cannot tell you with certainty what will happen if it resumes, only that the armor did not harm him during the pause, which is itself unprecedented." Hartley considered this for a long moment. "And your professional judgment, Keeper, should we proceed?" I looked past him, toward the chamber where the armor stood silent and waiting, its new markings still glowing faintly along its surface, a question written in a language none of us could yet read. "I believe," I said slowly, "that this armor has waited 900 years for something. I do not know what that something is, but I do not believe it would have paused, would have changed, would have shown us something new after 9 centuries of unbroken silence, unless it recognized something in your soldier that it has never recognized before. I think we would be foolish to walk away from that discovery out of caution alone." Hartley studied me carefully, then turned to look at Ethan, who stood a short distance away, quietly enduring the attention of Vorathi merchants, who whispered behind their hands, and a Threll attaché, who watched him with an expression I could not fully read. "Then let us proceed," Hartley said finally, "carefully, but let us proceed. The coalition does not have the luxury of turning away from possibilities right now, however strange they may be." I nodded, and felt something stir in my chest that I had not felt in longer than I cared to admit. After 3 centuries of watching failure after failure, of believing I understood the limits of what this shrine could offer the galaxy, I found myself standing at the edge of something entirely new, something that made even my long, patient Vantiri heart beat a little faster. We would resume the trial, and whatever answer the armor gave this time, I suspected it would change far more than the fate of one young soldier from a small, stubborn species that had only just learned to walk among the stars. We gathered in the chamber again 3 days later, once the scholars had finished their initial examinations and Colonel Hartley had received clearance from Fleet Command to proceed with what everyone had begun calling the second trial, a phrase that felt strange to say aloud, given that no champion in recorded history had ever earned a second attempt. The chamber felt different that morning. Word of the pause had spread far enough that the observation gallery, normally reserved for a handful of officials, was now crowded with representatives from a dozen different worlds, all of them pressed against the railing, all of them watching Ethan Cole with an intensity that would have made most people uncomfortable. He did not seem to notice them, or if he did, he hid it well, his attention fixed entirely on the armor at the center of the room. "Are you ready?" I asked him, standing beside the pedestal, as I had stood beside it for 300 years, though never before with quite this particular mixture of dread and anticipation twisting through my chest. No, he said honestly, but I don't think waiting is going to make me any more ready than I am right now. I appreciated the honesty. Most of the champions I had watched over the centuries entered this chamber wrapped in false confidence, certain of victories they had no reasonable claim to. Ethan's honesty about his own uncertainty felt, strangely, like the first genuinely promising sign I had witnessed since he arrived. Then reach out, I said, and let us see what it says this time. He stepped forward, extended his hand, and placed it against the armor's surface, exactly as he had 3 days earlier. The light came instantly this time, faster and brighter than before, the ancient symbols flaring across the entire suit rather than just the chest plate, spreading outward like a fire finding new fuel. The humming sound returned as well, but deeper now, more resonant, filling the chamber in a way that made the stone floor beneath my feet vibrate faintly. Ferris, standing beside me with his data slate raised to record every detail, let out a soft gasp. The energy readings are climbing faster than anything in our historical records. Keeper Voss, this is nothing like a rejection pattern. This is something building. I watched Ethan's face carefully, searching for any sign of pain, any indication that the process was harming him, but instead I saw something that looked almost like concentration, the expression of a person working through a difficult problem rather than someone caught in agony. His jaw was tight, his eyes closed, but his breathing remained steady. "What are you seeing?" I asked him quietly, uncertain whether he could even hear me through whatever was happening. "Images," he said, his voice strained but clear. "Not words, just pictures, feelings. It's showing me things." "What kind of things?" He was quiet for a long moment, his brow furrowing deeper. "Battles. Old ones, I think, older than anything I've studied, and something else. Someone standing alone against something huge, refusing to run even though running would have made sense. Refusing to give up a position that couldn't be held, because giving it up would have meant everyone behind them died instead." Corin, who had positioned himself near the front of the gallery, despite his earlier skepticism, leaned forward with obvious fascination. "It is testing him against a memory," he said, almost to himself, "against some standard preserved in its own understanding of worth." I did not know if Corin was correct, but the theory fit what little evidence we had. The armor was not simply scanning Ethan's body or his physical capabilities, the way a weapon might be tested for its specifications. It was searching for something deeper, some quality that had nothing to do with strength or speed, or the traditional markers of a great warrior. The light in the chamber grew brighter still, and then, without warning, the armor began to move. I had never seen this happen before, not once in 300 years, and judging by the sudden collective intake of breath from the gallery, no one else present had either. The plating along the armor's surface shifted, panels sliding and reconfiguring with a soft mechanical grace that suggested design rather than damage, the entire suit reshaping itself in ways too subtle to describe precisely, but unmistakable in their overall effect. It was preparing itself. It was preparing itself for something. "Keeper Voss," Priya said urgently from where she stood near the gallery entrance. "Is this normal? Should we intervene?" "Nothing about this has been normal since the moment he walked into this chamber," I said, my eyes fixed on the transformation taking place before us. "I do not believe intervention is possible now, even if we wish to attempt it." The armor's transformation completed with a final pulse of light, and then, slowly, deliberately, it began to detach itself from the pedestal that had held it in place for 900 years. It moved toward Ethan not with violence, not with the sudden lethal speed that had ended every previous trial in an instant, but with something that almost resembled invitation, the plating opening along seams that had never before been visible, revealing an interior structure clearly meant to accommodate a wearer. "It wants you to put it on," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, hardly able to believe the words as I spoke them. Ethan opened his eyes, staring at the armor now hovering before him, its interior open and waiting. "Is that safe?" "I genuinely do not know," I admitted. "No one alive has ever seen this. You would be the first, in 900 years, to reach this point." He looked past the armor, to where Colonel Hartley stood at the edge of the gallery, watching with an expression that mixed hope and worry in equal measure. Hartley gave a small nod, not an order exactly, but a signal that the decision, ultimately, belonged to Ethan alone. "Whatever happens," Ethan said, mostly to himself, "at least I'll know I didn't back away from it." He stepped forward, and the armor closed around him. The process took only a few seconds, though it felt considerably longer to everyone watching. The plating settled into place across his shoulders, his chest, his limbs, each piece finding its position with a precision that suggested the armor had been built specifically for a form very close to his own, despite having existed for 9 centuries before humanity had even developed the technology to leave its own solar system. When the final piece locked into position across his helmet, sealing the suit completely, the light that had filled the chamber suddenly dimmed, settling into a steady, quiet glow along the seams of the armor, calmer now than it had been throughout the entire trial. Silence fell over the gallery. No one spoke, no one seemed to breathe. Then Ethan raised one armored hand, turning it slowly in front of his helmet, examining the fit, the movement, the strange new weight and balance of a suit that had rejected 211 wielders before finally, impossibly, choosing him. "It fits," he said, and his voice carried a strange quality now, resonant in a way it had not been before, as though the armor itself was amplifying and reshaping the sound in some manner none of us fully understood. "It actually fits." The gallery erupted into noise, officials and observers breaking their stunned silence all at once, voices overlapping in a dozen different languages, questions and exclamations tangled together into a wall of sound that filled the ancient chamber for the first time in longer than I could remember. I stood apart from the noise, watching the armored figure at the center of the room, feeling something I had not expected to feel after 300 years of quiet, patient service. I felt afraid, not of Ethan himself, who still carried the same quiet, steady manner he had shown since arriving at the shrine, but of what his success actually meant. 900 years of rejection was not simply bad luck repeated over and over. It was a pattern, deliberate and consistent, a standard that no warlord, no emperor, no legendary hero from any of the galaxy's oldest and most powerful species had managed to meet. And now that standard had finally been met, not by strength, not by ambition, not by any of the qualities the galaxy traditionally celebrated in its champions, but by something else entirely, something this armor had apparently been waiting 9 centuries to find. I looked toward Corin, whose earlier scorn had transformed completely into something far more unsettling, a calculating watchfulness that made me wonder exactly what he intended to report back to whatever remained of his Threll contacts. I looked toward the Vorathi merchants, already murmuring among themselves about value and opportunity, seeing in this moment nothing more than a new commodity to exploit. And I looked toward Colonel Hartley, whose expression carried the particular weight of a man who understood, more clearly than anyone else in the room, exactly how desperately his people needed this moment to mean something real. "Keeper Voss," Ferris said quietly beside me, his data slate trembling slightly in his hands. "In 900 years of recorded history, this armor has never accepted a single wielder. Do you understand what we have just witnessed?" "I understand that a question 9 centuries old has finally been answered," I said. "I do not yet understand what that answer truly means, or what it will cost the galaxy to find out." Ethan turned toward us then, the armor moving with a fluid, natural grace that suggested he had been wearing it his entire life, rather than mere seconds, and even through the sealed helmet, I felt certain that whatever expression his face carried beneath that plating, it matched the quiet uncertainty in his voice when he finally spoke again. "So what happens now?" he asked, and the question hung in the air of that ancient chamber like the opening line of a story none of us yet knew how to finish. What happened next was 3 weeks of tests, questions and arguments, none of which I found particularly enjoyable, though all of which I understood to be necessary. Fleet Command was not willing to simply celebrate an unprecedented event and move on. They wanted to understand it, measure it, and above all, determine whether it could actually help win a war that grew more desperate with every passing month. I spent those 3 weeks working alongside Ferris and a growing team of scholars, poring over the new symbols that had appeared across the armor's surface during the trial. Symbols that none of us could fully translate but that seemed to shift subtly whenever Ethan wore the suit, as though the armor was still learning about its wearer even after accepting him. We learned that the armor amplified physical capability significantly, though not without limit, and more importantly, we learned that it seemed to respond to something beyond simple physical command. It responds to intention, Ferris explained during one of our late evening sessions, holding up a data slate covered in energy readings that meant considerably more to him than they did to me. Watch this recording carefully, Keeper Voss. Private Cole is not issuing verbal commands or manual controls. The armor is anticipating his needs before he consciously forms them. I watched the recording, footage from one of the earlier tests, where Ethan had been asked to perform basic physical tasks while wearing the armor, lifting objects of increasing weight, moving through obstacle courses designed by coalition engineers. In each case, the armor's response arrived a fraction of a second before Ethan's own muscles began to move, as though it was reading something deeper than simple electrical signals from his nervous system. "You believe it reads more than his body," I said. "I believe it reads something closer to his intent, his will, perhaps even his character," Ferris said. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the armor truly judges character rather than simple physical fitness, then its rejection of 211 champions was not a failure of strength. It was a judgment of who those champions actually were, beneath whatever reputation or title they carried. That thought stayed with me long after Ferris had gone to rest that night. I thought of Osek, the Draemir warlord thrown across the chamber only weeks earlier, a man who had built an empire through conquest and fear. I thought of dozens of other champions across the centuries, warriors celebrated across their own worlds for cruelty disguised as strength, ambition disguised as courage. If the armor had been judging something deeper than capability all along, then perhaps its centuries of rejection had never been a mystery at all. Perhaps it had simply been waiting for someone whose strength came from a different source entirely. Colonel Hartley arrived at the shrine near the end of the third week with news that shifted the entire situation from a scholarly curiosity into something considerably more urgent. "The Threll have begun a new offensive," he told me and Ethan during a private briefing, his weathered face carrying the particular strain of someone who had been reading difficult reports for days without rest. 3 systems along the coalition border have already fallen. Fleet Command believes the enemy is preparing a major push toward Ashvale Station, which would open a direct path toward several core coalition worlds if it succeeds. "How long do we have?" Ethan asked, no longer wearing the armor for this meeting, dressed instead in his simple coalition uniform, though something in his posture had changed subtly since the trial, a quiet steadiness that had not been there before. "Estimates suggest 2 weeks before the Threll fleet reaches Ashvale in strength," Hartley said. "Fewer if their advance continues at its current pace. And Fleet Command wants to know if I should be deployed there," Ethan said. It was not a question. Hartley nodded slowly. "There is significant disagreement within the command structure. Some officers believe deploying an unproven asset into a critical engagement is reckless. Others believe we cannot afford to waste any advantage we have discovered, however unusual its origin might be." "What do you believe?" I asked him, curious, despite the fact that the decision was not mine to make. Hartley was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I believe we have spent 3 years losing ground to an enemy that outnumbers us, outproduces us, and has been fighting wars of conquest for longer than humanity has known how to build starships. I believe the coalition needs something that changes the calculation, and I believe, however strange it may sound, that this armor and this soldier may be exactly that. But I also believe the decision to walk into that engagement should belong to the person wearing the armor, not to officers sitting safely behind desks." Every eye in the room turned to Ethan, who sat quietly for a moment, considering the weight of what was being asked of him. I found myself watching him closely, searching for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of the fear that would have been entirely reasonable given the circumstances. "I didn't come here looking for a legend," he said finally. "I came here because Fleet Command sent me, and honestly, I expected to fail like everyone else. But if this armor chose me for a reason, and if that reason means I can actually make a difference at Ashvale Station, then I don't see how I could say no and live with myself afterward. My unit is out there somewhere along that same front, so are a lot of other people's units. I'm not going to sit here safely while they're facing something I might actually be able to help against. Hartley studied him for a long moment, then nodded, the decision effectively made. Then we prepare for deployment. Keeper Voss, I understand the armor has never left this shrine in its recorded history. Are there restrictions we should know about? None that I am aware of, I said, though the words felt strange leaving my mouth, another first in a string of firsts that had begun the moment this quiet, stubborn human had walked through the shrine's ancient doors. The armor has never left because it never had a wielder to carry it anywhere. That circumstance has apparently changed. The preparations that followed moved quickly, faster than I was accustomed to after centuries spent in a place where time moved slowly and rarely with urgency. Coalition engineers arrived to study the armor's compatibility with standard equipment, communication systems, and tactical networks, while Ethan spent long hours in additional trials, learning the extent and limits of what the armor could actually do in practical combat scenarios, rather than the controlled tests we had run within the shrine. I chose, somewhat to my own surprise, to accompany the deployment myself. 3 centuries of guarding this armor had left me with knowledge no one else possessed, and I told myself that knowledge might prove useful should anything unexpected occur during whatever confrontation awaited at Ashvale Station. In truth, I suspect I simply could not bring myself to remain behind, watching from a distance, after being present for the single most significant event in the shrine's 9-century history. I wanted to see what happened next. I needed to see it. Corin requested passage as well, citing his experience with Threll military tactics as justification, though I remained uncertain of his true motivations, even as Hartley granted the request. The Threll defector had grown considerably quieter since witnessing the second trial, his earlier scorn replaced by something more thoughtful, though I could not tell whether that thoughtfulness reflected genuine reconsideration or simply careful calculation about which side of this unfolding story he wished to be standing on when it concluded. The journey to Ashvale Station took 4 days aboard a coalition transport ship, days I spent largely in quiet conversation with Ethan, learning more about the species that had, against every historical precedent, finally earned this armor's trust. He spoke of his homeworld with a mixture of affection and honesty that I found refreshing after centuries spent listening to champions boast about the glories of their civilizations. He described conflicts his people had fought among themselves, mistakes his species had made and was still making, alongside the stubborn persistence that seemed to run through every story he told, a refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed the only reasonable outcome. "You keep talking about persistence," I said during one of these conversations, "but persistence alone does not explain why the armor chose you over champions who possessed far greater strength, far greater skill in combat." Ethan considered this for a while before answering. "Maybe it's not really about persistence on its own. Maybe it's about what the persistence is for. Every champion who tried before me, from what you've told me, was fighting for something that started and ended with themselves. Glory, power, proving they were the strongest. I wasn't trying to prove anything when I touched that armor. I was just thinking about the people back at Ashfield, wondering if there was anything I could actually do to help them." I turned that answer over in my mind for a long while after our conversation ended, watching the stars shift slowly outside the transport's viewport as we drew closer to the front lines of a war that had already claimed more lives than I cared to calculate. Perhaps Ethan was right. Perhaps 900 years of rejection had never been about strength at all, but about a very particular kind of will, one measured not by ambition but by the willingness to stand for something beyond oneself, a quality that a young, struggling species with everything to lose might understand better than any ancient, powerful empire ever had. We arrived at the edge of the Ashvale system on the 4th day, and the moment our transport dropped out of faster-than-light travel, the view screens filled with the unmistakable signatures of an approaching Threll fleet, larger and more numerous than any of the intelligence reports had suggested, stretching across the darkness like an advancing storm that showed no sign of slowing. Ethan stood beside me at the viewport, already dressed in the armor that had chosen him, watching the same terrible sight I was watching. "That's a lot more ships than Command said there would be," he said quietly. "Yes," I said, "it is." He was silent for a moment, and then, without looking away from the viewport, he spoke again, his voice steady despite everything unfolding before us. "Then I guess we're about to find out exactly what this armor was waiting 900 years to do." I said nothing in response, because there was nothing left to say. The war had finally arrived at our doorstep, and whatever the galaxy believed it understood about strength, about worth, about the fragile, stubborn species called humanity, all of it was about to be tested against a force large enough to end the argument permanently, one way or another. Ashvale Station was a mid-sized coalition outpost, built into the hollowed core of an asteroid decades earlier, serving as a supply hub and communication relay for the entire southern stretch of the front. It was not designed to withstand a full fleet engagement, and everyone aboard our transport understood that fact clearly as the scale of the approaching Threll force became visible on our sensors. Colonel Hartley had transferred his command temporarily to the station itself, coordinating with the local garrison commander, a stern woman named Major Grace Whitfield, who had been holding this section of the front for the better part of a year, with fewer resources than she needed, and more responsibility than any single officer should reasonably carry. She met us at the docking bay with the tired efficiency of someone who had stopped expecting good news months earlier. "Colonel," she said, offering a sharp salute before her eyes shifted to the armored figure standing beside me. "And this must be the asset Fleet Command has been so secretive about." "Ethan Cole," Ethan said, extending a hand that Whitfield shook briskly. "Major Whitfield," she replied. "I hope whatever you can do lives up to the reports, because the fleet approaching us outnumbers our defenses roughly 4-1, and that estimate assumes reinforcements arrive on schedule, which they have not once managed to do in the past 3 engagements." Hartley asked, moving quickly past introductions toward the practical matter of the coming battle. Whitfield led us toward the station's command center, a cramped room filled with tactical displays showing the slow, inevitable approach of Threll warships across the system's outer boundary. "Their fleet will reach engagement range within 6 hours. We have evacuated non-essential personnel already, but the station itself cannot be relocated, and losing it would open a direct corridor toward 3 inhabited systems behind us. Our orders are to hold as long as possible while reinforcements are diverted from the northern front, though I have serious doubts about how quickly those reinforcements can actually arrive." "How long can the station hold on its own?" Ethan asked. Whitfield's expression tightened. "Honestly, Private Cole, my best estimate is somewhere between 2 and 4 hours before their numbers overwhelm our defense grid entirely. After that, this station and everyone still aboard it becomes a very simple problem for the Threll to solve." The room fell quiet for a moment, the weight of that timeline settling over everyone present. I found myself watching Ethan carefully, searching for any reaction, any sign of the fear that would have been entirely understandable given what he was hearing. "Then I guess we need to figure out how I can actually make a difference in that window," he said, his voice steady despite everything. Over the following hours, Whitfield's tactical staff worked alongside Hartley and Ethan to develop a plan that made use of the armor's unique capabilities in ways that might actually shift the coming engagement. The armor, our tests had shown, granted Ethan extraordinary physical resilience, the ability to survive conditions that would be immediately lethal to an unprotected person, along with defensive capabilities that seemed to generate some manner of protective field around anyone standing close enough to him. It was not, by itself, capable of destroying an entire fleet, but it was capable of protecting critical systems, of surviving direct engagement with Threll ground forces should any attempt to breach the station, and perhaps most importantly, of buying time. If they attempt a boarding action to disable our defense grid from the inside, which their tactics have favored in 3 previous engagements along this front, then having someone capable of holding a critical junction against overwhelming numbers could prove decisive, Whitfield explained, pointing toward a schematic of the station's internal layout. The primary power relay here would be their most logical target. Losing it would cripple our shield generators within minutes. "Then that's where I need to be," Ethan said without hesitation. I felt a familiar unease settle over me as the plan solidified, the same unease I had felt watching 211 champions walk toward their own trials over the centuries, though this time the stakes extended far beyond a single life. If Ethan fell defending that relay, the consequences would ripple across the entire coalition war effort, and I found myself, despite 3 centuries of careful detachment, genuinely afraid of losing this quiet, stubborn young man who had somehow earned trust from an ancient artifact that had rejected every other champion the galaxy had to offer. "You do not have to do this alone," I told him quietly, while the tactical staff continued their preparations around us. "I have studied this armor longer than anyone alive. If there is anything I can offer, any insight that might help you survive what is coming, I intend to give it." "I'd appreciate that," Ethan said, and then, after a pause, he added something that surprised me. "Can I ask you something, Keeper Voss? Do you actually think I can do this? Not the armor, me." I considered the question carefully before answering, because I did not believe in offering false comfort, not after 3 centuries spent watching genuine failure up close. I have watched countless champions enter that shrine believing themselves destined for greatness, and I watched every one of them fail, because their belief in themselves was never matched by anything deeper. You have not spoken once, in all the time I have known you, about your own greatness. You speak instead about the people you are trying to protect. I do not know if that quality alone will be enough to win this battle, but I believe, more than I have believed anything in 300 years of service, that it was enough to earn you the chance to try. Ethan seemed to absorb that answer for a long moment, and then he nodded once, a small gesture that carried more determination than any grand declaration could have offered. "Then let's not waste the chance." The Threll fleet arrived precisely on schedule, 6 hours after our own arrival at the station, their warships emerging from the darkness in numbers that made even the tactical displays feel inadequate to capture the true scale of the threat. Whitfield's defense grid activated immediately, energy shields flaring to life around the station's most critical sections, while what remained of the local coalition fleet moved to intercept the advancing enemy line, buying precious time through maneuvers that everyone aboard the station understood were, at best, a delaying action against an overwhelming force. I stationed myself in the station's secondary command center alongside Ferris, who had accompanied our deployment to continue documenting whatever unfolded, both of us watching tactical displays that painted an increasingly grim picture as the battle began in earnest. Coalition fighters engaged Threll interceptors in the space surrounding the station, explosions blooming silently across the display in patterns that told a story of losses mounting faster than anyone wanted to acknowledge. 40 minutes into the engagement, exactly as Whitfield had predicted, Threll boarding pods detached from a cluster of warships and began their approach toward the station's hull, their trajectory aimed with unmistakable precision toward the section housing the primary power relay. "They're moving on the relay," Whitfield confirmed grimly, watching the same data I was watching. "Cole, they're headed your way." "Copy that." Ethan's voice came back through the comm system, steady despite the tension audible beneath it. "Standing by." I watched the display as the boarding pods made contact with the station's outer hull, breach alarms sounding through the corridors near the relay chamber where Ethan had positioned himself, and then, through the limited camera feeds still functioning in that section, I watched the first Threll boarding party emerge into the corridor, weapons raised, moving with the disciplined efficiency of soldiers who had conducted this exact maneuver successfully many times before. What happened next unfolded faster than the camera feeds could properly capture, but the outcome was unmistakable even through grainy, interrupted footage. Ethan moved to meet the boarding party directly, the armor responding with the same fluid, anticipatory grace we had observed during his training exercises, deflecting incoming fire with whatever protective field the suit generated, closing the distance toward the Threll soldiers with a speed that seemed to catch them entirely off guard. "Their advance has stopped," Ferris said, his voice tight with disbelief as he studied the readings feeding into our display. "Keeper Voss, look at these numbers. He is holding the entire corridor by himself." I watched, my hands gripping the edge of the console tighter than I intended, as the footage showed wave after wave of Threll soldiers attempting to push past a single armored figure standing between them and the relay they desperately needed to reach, each attempt ending the same way, repelled, redirected, held back by a defense that seemed to grow more precise with every passing minute, rather than weakening under sustained pressure. "The relay is holding," Whitfield reported, relief cutting through the strain in her voice for the first time since the engagement had begun. "Shield generators still operational. If he can maintain that position, we can hold long enough for the reinforcement window." The battle continued for nearly 2 more hours, the Coalition's outnumbered fleet fighting a desperate holding action in the space around the station, while Ethan held the critical corridor against repeated boarding attempts, and I found myself watching every moment of that footage with a mixture of pride and terror that I had never expected to feel after 3 centuries spent believing myself immune to such things. This was not the swift, clean rejection I had witnessed 211 times before. This was something far more difficult to watch. A young soldier from a species barely 50 years into the stars, standing alone against overwhelming odds, holding a line that everyone else on that station depended on, simply because he had refused, from the very first moment I met him, to believe that giving up was ever truly an option. When reinforcements finally arrived, 3 hours behind schedule but not too late to matter, the Threll fleet began its withdrawal, their commanders apparently unwilling to commit to a prolonged engagement against a station that had proven far more resilient than their intelligence had predicted. As the enemy ships retreated into the darkness beyond the system's edge, I felt the tension in the command center finally begin to ease, replaced by the exhausted, disbelieving relief of people who had genuinely expected to lose everything only hours earlier. Ethan emerged from the relay corridor sometime later, the armor still intact around him, though I could see through the small gaps in its plating that he was breathing heavily, exhausted in a way that no amount of physical enhancement could fully mask. Whitfield met him personally, her earlier exhaustion replaced by something closer to genuine astonishment. "You held that corridor against 6 separate boarding waves," she said, still seeming to struggle with the reality of what she was describing. "Private Cole, I have never seen anything like what your armor's sensors just recorded." "I just did what needed doing," Ethan said quietly, the same modest answer he had given me back at the shrine, though now it carried the weight of an entire battle behind it, rather than simple uncertainty. News of the engagement at Ashvale Station spread through Coalition channels within hours, and I understood, even before Colonel Hartley confirmed it later that evening, that this single battle had changed something fundamental in how the galaxy would view the quiet, stubborn species that had finally earned an ancient armor's trust after 900 years of unbroken rejection. Whatever had been building toward this moment since the second trial had finally arrived, and there would be no returning to the way things had been before it. In the weeks that followed the defense of Ashvale Station, I watched the reaction spread across the galaxy with a mixture of fascination and growing concern, because the story of what had happened there did not stay contained within Coalition military channels for very long. By the time we returned to the shrine to continue our study of the armor and its new wielder, reports of the battle had already reached every major power in known space, carried by traders, diplomats, and the kind of rapid rumor that no censorship effort ever quite manages to contain. The reactions varied considerably, depending on who was reacting. Within the Coalition itself, morale shifted almost overnight. Exhausted soldiers along a dozen different fronts, speaking of the battle at Ashvale, with a hope that had been noticeably absent from military communications for months. Colonel Hartley told me during one of our briefings that recruitment applications from smaller member species had climbed sharply in the weeks following the engagement, civilizations that had previously hesitated to fully commit resources to a war they privately believed was already lost. Outside the Coalition, the reaction was considerably more complicated. Corinne, who had returned with us to the shrine after witnessing the battle firsthand, spent long hours in conversation with visiting scholars and officials, his earlier scorn for humanity replaced entirely by a careful, almost anxious fascination that I found myself watching with interest. "You have changed your opinion considerably," I said to him one evening, finding him alone in the shrine's outer courtyard, staring up at the stars with an expression I could not fully read. "I have," he admitted, without any of the defensiveness I might have expected from someone confronting how wrong their earlier judgment had been. I spent decades believing humanity's inclusion in this war was a strategic irrelevance, a small species making noise far beyond its actual weight. I was wrong, and admitting that is uncomfortable, but far less uncomfortable than pretending otherwise would be. What troubles you now, then? I asked, sensing there was more behind his contemplative mood than simple embarrassment. Corin was quiet for a long moment before answering. The Threll Dominion has spent centuries building an empire on the belief that strength alone determines worth, that conquest is simply the natural order of things playing out as it should. I left that empire because I could no longer accept that belief, but I understand how it thinks, Keeper Voss, better than most people in this shrine ever will. And I am telling you, the Dominion will not simply accept what happened at Ashvale Station as an isolated incident. They will study it. They will try to understand what allowed a single human wearing ancient armor to hold an entire corridor against their finest soldiers, and once they believe they understand it, they will either try to counter it, or they will try to take it for themselves. His words settled uncomfortably in my chest, because I had been harboring similar concerns since the battle's aftermath, watching the careful, calculating attention of Vorathi merchants and diplomatic observers who had begun arriving at the shrine in increasing numbers, all of them hoping to glimpse the armor, to understand its secrets, to determine what value it might hold for their own purposes. You believe they will attempt to replicate the trial, I said. I believe they already have, Corin said grimly. I received word yesterday, through contacts I maintained after leaving the Dominion, that Threll intelligence has recovered records of at least 2 other precursor relics believed to be similar in origin to this armor. If they succeed in awakening either of those relics, the balance this war has struck may shift in ways none of us can fully predict. I brought this concern to Colonel Hartley the following morning, and I watched his expression grow increasingly grave as I relayed what Corin had shared. Ethan sat nearby during this conversation, having spent the intervening weeks recovering from the physical and mental strain of the Ashvale engagement, though I noted that his recovery seemed to be proceeding more quickly than any of the Coalition's medical staff had initially predicted, another small mystery that Ferris attributed, cautiously, to some lingering effect of the armor's continued presence. If the Threll succeed in awakening a relic of their own, Hartley said slowly, we could find ourselves facing an enemy with capabilities matching or exceeding what we currently possess. Fleet Command needs to know about this immediately. There is something else you should consider, I said, choosing my next words carefully. Corin's theory and my own observations suggest that this armor did not simply choose Ethan because he was human. It chose him because of specific qualities he possesses, qualities that appear connected to how his species approaches conflict and sacrifice. If other precursor relics operate according to similar principles, then whatever the Threll manage to awaken will reflect something about their own civilization's true character, whether they intend it to or not. Hartley considered this for a long moment. You are suggesting the relics might reveal something the Threll would rather keep hidden. I am suggesting, I said, that ancient artifacts, built to judge worth, do not typically care about the reputation a civilization presents to outsiders. They care about what lies beneath that reputation. Whatever the Threll awaken, if they succeed at all, will tell us something true about the empire they have built, whether that truth serves their interests or not. In the following weeks, reports trickled in from Coalition intelligence networks describing exactly the kind of activity Corin had warned us to expect. Threll forces had reportedly secured access to a precursor site deep within contested territory, and while details remained frustratingly sparse, the pattern of activity suggested attempts at some manner of ritual trial similar to what we had witnessed at the shrine. Ethan continued his own training during this period, spending long hours working alongside Whitfield's most experienced tactical officers, refining his understanding of the armor's capabilities and limits. I joined many of these sessions myself, continuing to document new discoveries about the ancient technology that had chosen him, and I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, developing something resembling genuine friendship with this quiet, stubborn young soldier who had upended 9 centuries of my carefully maintained understanding of the shrine I had guarded for so long. Do you ever think about what happens if the Threll actually manage to wake up one of their own relics? Ethan asked me during one such session, taking a brief rest between exercises, sweat visible along his brow despite the armor's protective properties. Constantly, I admitted. It troubles me more than I would like to acknowledge. Why does it trouble you specifically? He asked. I mean, beyond the obvious reasons. I considered the question carefully before answering, because it deserved an honest response rather than a simple deflection. Because for 300 years I believed this shrine existed as a kind of judgment, a standard so demanding that no one could meet it, a permanent reminder that true worth was rare and precious precisely because it was so difficult to achieve. Your success did not diminish that belief, Ethan. It confirmed it, in a way I had not expected. But if the Thrall succeed in awakening a relic of their own, it will force me to ask an uncomfortable question. Was this armor's standard truly rare, or was it simply waiting for the right kind of person to arrive, regardless of which species or civilization that person came from? Ethan was quiet for a while, considering my words with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to most conversations. Maybe it doesn't matter which answer turns out to be true, he said eventually. Either way, the armor found what it was looking for. Whatever the Thrall wake up, if they wake up anything at all, it's going to have to answer to whatever standard it was actually built around, the same way I had to answer to whatever standard this armor was built around. If their relic reflects who they really are, the way you're suggesting, then maybe we don't need to fear it as much as we think. Maybe we just need to understand it. His perspective offered a small measure of comfort, though I could not fully shake the unease that had settled over me since Corin's warning. The galaxy that had once dismissed humanity as an irrelevant footnote in a war fought by far older and more powerful civilizations had begun, in the span of only a few short months, to view the small, stubborn species with something closer to wary respect, and I understood, with the clarity that came from 3 centuries of patient observation, that this shift in perception would not simply fade away regardless of what the Thrall managed to accomplish with their own ancient discoveries. Something fundamental had changed the moment Ethan Cole touched that armor, and it did not throw him across the chamber. The galaxy's understanding of strength, of worth, of what made a civilization dangerous or valuable, had been quietly, irreversibly rewritten, and whatever came next, whether from the Thrall's desperate attempts to reclaim their own advantage, or from the continued unfolding of whatever destiny this armor had chosen for its new wielder, I understood that we were no longer simply watching a war unfold. We were watching the galaxy slowly, uncomfortably, come to terms with a truth it had never expected to face, that the smallest, youngest species among the stars might carry within it something far more significant than anyone had ever imagined. The confirmation we had all been dreading arrived 2 months later, delivered through an urgent coalition briefing that Colonel Hartley requested I attend personally, given my continued involvement in understanding the armor and everything connected to it. The Thrall Dominion, according to intelligence gathered from multiple independent sources, had succeeded in awakening a relic of their own, a discovery buried within a fortress world, deep in contested territory, and unlike the long, careful trials our shrine had conducted over 9 centuries, the Thrall had apparently found a way to accelerate the process considerably, driven by the desperate urgency of a war that had begun turning against them. Their relic has already claimed a wielder, Hartley told the assembled officers, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone delivering news he wished were not true. A Thrall commander named Vex Toran, formerly responsible for several of their most brutal border campaigns. Early reports suggest capabilities comparable to what we witnessed at Ashvale Station, though we lack detailed data on the full extent of what this new relic grants its wielder. I felt the weight of Corin's earlier warning settle over the room, and I noticed him standing near the back of the briefing, his expression carrying none of the satisfaction that might have come from having his prediction proven accurate, only a grim, weary concern that matched my own. "What does Fleet Command recommend?" Ethan asked, standing beside me with the same steady composure he had carried through every difficult moment since his arrival at the shrine. "Intelligence suggests the Thrall intend to use this new asset to spearhead a major offensive toward the Coalition's central worlds within the coming weeks," Hartley said. "Given the stakes involved, Fleet Command believes a direct confrontation may become unavoidable, and they have specifically requested your availability should that confrontation occur." I watched Ethan absorb this information, and I thought back to our earlier conversation about what the Threll's relic might reveal about the empire that had awakened it. Whatever standard that relic operated by, whatever qualities it had judged worthy in the commander who now wielded it, we were about to discover the answer in the most direct way possible, on a battlefield where the stakes extended far beyond any single engagement. The confrontation arrived 3 weeks later at a contested system called Verengard, positioned along a critical supply corridor that both sides desperately needed to control. I traveled with Ethan once again, alongside Priya, Ferris, and a somewhat reluctant Corin, whose knowledge of Threll military doctrine had proven valuable enough that Hartley insisted on his continued presence, despite the obvious discomfort it caused him, given that this battle would likely put him face to face with soldiers from the Empire he had once served. The engagement began much as Ashvale had, with fleets clashing in the space surrounding a critical objective, though this time both sides understood exactly what additional factor waited at the center of the conflict. Reports from forward scouts confirmed that Vex Toran had been deployed personally, leading a Threll assault force toward the same strategic target that coalition forces were determined to hold. Ethan met him in the ruins of an old mining station positioned at the heart of the contested system, a location neither side had planned to make the focal point of the battle, but which circumstance and tactical necessity had transformed into exactly that. I watched the engagement unfold through sensor feeds relayed to our command ship, my hands gripping the edge of the console with the same tension I had felt watching the corridor defense at Ashvale, though this time compounded by the knowledge that whatever happened in the next several minutes would answer questions that had haunted me since Corin's warning weeks earlier. Vex Toran's armor, from what our sensors could determine, granted him considerable strength and resilience, comparable in many respects to what Ethan's own armor provided. But as the engagement progressed, I began to notice something else, something that Ferris pointed out with growing certainty as he studied the data streaming across our displays. "His movements are aggressive but undisciplined," Ferris observed, watching the same footage I was watching. "He is pressing forward without regard for the soldiers around him, using his own advantage to advance his personal position rather than protecting the forces under his command." Compare that to Ethan's approach at Ashvale, where every action was oriented toward holding a position that protected others rather than advancing his own standing. The pattern became increasingly clear as the confrontation continued. Vex Toran fought with tremendous personal power, but that power seemed entirely focused inward, a demonstration of dominance rather than an act of protection, and I began to understand, with growing clarity, exactly what Ethan had meant weeks earlier when he suggested that whatever relic the Threll awakened would reveal something true about the empire that had claimed it. The two armored figures clashed directly near the heart of the mining station, and I watched with my breath held tight in my chest as they exchanged blows that would have killed any unarmored soldier instantly, the ancient technology protecting them both from damage that should have been catastrophic. But even in this direct confrontation, the difference in their approach remained visible. Ethan fought defensively, positioning himself repeatedly between Vex Toran and the coalition soldiers attempting to secure the station's critical systems, absorbing pressure that would otherwise have fallen on people far less capable of surviving it. Vex Toran fought to win personally, disregarding the soldiers around him entirely, treating the battle as a test of his own supremacy, rather than a defense of anything beyond his own reputation. "He is protecting his people," Corin said quietly, watching the same footage with an expression I had never seen him wear before, something that looked almost like grief for the empire he had once called home. "Toran is not. This is exactly the difference I feared we would see, Keeper Voss. And I believe it will determine the outcome of this confrontation more than raw strength ever could." The battle continued for nearly 20 minutes, longer than any engagement I had witnessed since Ashvale, but slowly, gradually, the pattern Corin had identified began to manifest in the actual outcome of the fight. Vex Toran's aggressive, self-focused approach left gaps that Ethan, fighting with the discipline of someone who understood exactly what he was protecting and why, began to exploit with increasing precision. Where Toran struck to dominate, Ethan struck to defend, and that fundamental difference in purpose translated, slowly but unmistakably, into a difference in outcome. The confrontation ended when Ethan, having weathered Toran's most aggressive assault, found an opening that his opponent's self-focused approach had left exposed, ending the engagement not through a killing blow, which our observations confirmed the armor seemed designed to avoid whenever possible, but through a decisive advantage that left Toran unable to continue the fight, his own armor's energy reserves depleted by an approach that had prioritized personal dominance over sustainable defense. The Threll forces, watching their champion fall, began an orderly withdrawal from the system rather than continuing an assault that had clearly lost its decisive advantage, and coalition forces secured the critical supply corridor that had brought both sides to this contested system in the first place. Ethan returned to our command ship hours later, exhausted but unharmed, and I found myself studying him with a new understanding of everything we had witnessed over the preceding months, from that first strange pause in the shrine's ancient trial to this decisive confrontation that had, I suspected, changed the trajectory of the entire war. "You were right," I told him quietly, once the immediate aftermath of the battle had settled and the command ship had begun its slow journey back toward coalition territory, about what the Threll's relic would reveal. It showed us exactly what that empire truly values, and it showed the entire galaxy the difference between strength used to dominate and strength used to protect. Was Alanim Morda. I didn't know for certain, Ethan admitted. I was hoping, but I didn't know. Perhaps that uncertainty was itself part of what made you the right choice, I said, and I meant it, more fully than I had meant almost anything, in 3 centuries of careful, patient observation. News of the confrontation at Verengard spread through the galaxy even faster than the reports from Ashvale had, and I watched, in the months that followed, as the balance of the war began shifting in ways that few had believed possible only a year earlier. Smaller species that had hesitated to fully commit to the coalition's cause began arriving in greater numbers, drawn by a story that had already become something closer to legend across a dozen different worlds. The Threll Dominion, having lost their gamble at Verengard, found themselves increasingly isolated as former allies quietly reconsidered their loyalties, uncertain whether continued support for an empire built on domination remained wise, given what the galaxy had just witnessed. I returned to the shrine eventually, though my role there had changed considerably from the quiet, solitary duty I had maintained for 3 centuries before Ethan Cole first walked through its ancient doors. The chamber that had once stood empty and silent, waiting 900 years for a single moment of recognition, now received a steady stream of visitors from across the galaxy, scholars and diplomats and curious observers, all of them hoping to understand what had happened there, all of them slowly coming to terms with a truth that I myself had needed considerable time to fully accept. I stood in that chamber one quiet evening, months after the battle at Verengard, looking at the empty pedestal where the armor had once rested for 9 centuries before finding its purpose. Ethan had gone on to further engagements, further victories that continued to shift the war's momentum in the coalition's favor, and reports suggested that coalition scholars, inspired by everything we had learned, had begun searching for other precursor sites across known space, wondering whether other relics existed, waiting for their own worthy wielders to arrive. I thought back to the countless champions who had walked into this chamber over the centuries, warlords and emperors, and celebrated heroes, each of them certain of their own greatness, each of them rejected within moments by a standard they never understood and never met. And I thought of a quiet, unremarkable soldier from a small, stubborn species barely 50 years into the stars, who had walked into this same chamber, expecting nothing more than another entry in a long list of failures, and had instead answered a question 900 years old. The galaxy had spent centuries believing that strength meant conquest, that greatness belonged naturally to whichever civilization could claim the most power, the oldest history, the greatest reach across the stars. It had taken this small, quiet armor and an even smaller, quieter soldier to prove that belief wrong in a way no argument or diplomacy ever could have managed. I do not know what other relics may still wait in forgotten corners of this galaxy, holding their own ancient standards, watching for their own worthy champions to arrive. But I know this much. After 3 centuries spent guarding one small chamber and one enormous mystery, the galaxy had spent 900 years searching for greatness in all the wrong places, among all the wrong species, and it had taken the arrival of humanity, small and young and stubbornly persistent, to finally show it where that greatness had been waiting all along. And somewhere among the stars, I suspect, other ancient guardians are watching humanity now, quietly, patiently, wondering whether the galaxy's oldest, most careful standard of worth has finally, after all these centuries, found the species it was always meant to find.